let's see how the Nib Critique Card and the Nib Xheight Sheet work together. So this is an interaction video, which technically is something you have to deal with constantly. Remember, there's no point in asking somebody which nib you're using because it's always about the nib, the ink, and the paper. Here it's about the Nib Critique Card so that you can take down information on some relevant information on how you feel the nib is working, as well as the Nib Xheight sheet, because that already assists you to have those lines. Now, when I'm writing, I prefer to write on a stable surface. So the pad that I'm using today for this is the Canson marker pad. And this is what it looks like. So it's this pad, the XL pad, and it says layout marker. It is 70 GSM or 18 pound. And that's a really good, weight for you to see the indirect grids, which are at 100%, through the top sheet of paper. Now, if I really, really want to test something accurately, I would rule directly onto the page so that I'm not looking at something through the sheet, because that can affect accuracy of line, especially when you're working at something like 2 mil. Of course, once you go down to 1 millimeter, it really is better to rule it up onto the sheet. Now, if you are ruling up, I use my lining template because it makes very, very quick work of ruling up a US letter size sheet or an A4 sheet. So all I have to do is drop my lining template onto the pad. I can pin it in place if I want to, or I can hold the frosted bits down, and because they're frosted, they create a non-slip surface. Now, I would rule up a series of 3s. So those are perfectly aligned to each other. They're very straight. And if I wanted to make a better sort of double up on the, actually I'll come down rather than, actually I'll go up. I'm just lining up the lines with the bottom of the cut, and I'm using the top of the cut. And I could basically make a stack of 3 millimeter and 6 millimeter lines. Now, if I'm working at 55 degrees, I just need to find the 55 degree angle, rest it on get the vertical lines vertical. I can even pin it in place to stop myself. If I feel I'm going to be a little bit clumsy, I can use the pins, tram pins, to pin it in place so I can slide it up and down the grid. Now, I'm just going to do every other line. There's a little marker on every other line. 1 and line 2 and mark 2 and there and there. That's done. So that gives me a really accurate set of lines to work off of if I decide I want to rule up the sheet. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to rule up the entire sheet because it's going to take too long, and I already have my 100% indirect grid at 2 millimeters here with the 55 degree lines on them. So let's take that sheet and slip it underneath here. And that will set my lines up. So I'm working in a pad, and then I can take it from there. Let's zoom in a little bit so that you can better see what I'm doing. All right, so let's get our Nib Critique card. So I have a separate one that I've cut out, and I'm going to fill everything in. So today is the 23rd of the 5th, 25. Okay, now, which nib am I going to start with? So I'm going to run through a series of nibs. I think I will focus on the Xheight 1068A. I don't need to write down the nib acquisition because I get them directly from the factory. So let's try to understand what I am doing with this nib. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to test the nib to see if it aligns itself. So you need your thumb for this, and I'm going to press. I'm going to press on my thumb. What I'm looking for is I'm looking to see if the tips of the tines align like that. Because if they're off like this or like that, you know the nib's not going to work. And if the tines, if the tip of the tines don't align at the tip, then when you come to writing, you're really going to struggle with the writing. Don't assume that when you buy a nib, it's going to work. A lot of people, I've seen lots of students in classes complain that, oh, I'm really terrible, I can't write. And I pick the nib up and I look at it and I'm like, well, of course you can't write. The nib's not going to work. Now, there are a number of other things that you need to look for. So I can't demonstrate this because I don't have a nib like this. But one of the things that you have to look for is you take the nib and on a white sheet of paper, you hold the nib over the sheet of paper and you look down between, so from the reservoir or the vent hole as it's called, you look down and you can see the nib where the tines open. If between there, not the best thing, not the best thing to demonstrate with. Let's get something. Actually, we can use a quill. If between where the tines separate, if you can see light between there, you can see the page between there, that nib is not going to work. Because it means instead of the tines at the ink channel being like this, when the tines spread, they would do this. If the tines are like this and you can see through it, means that the tines won't align properly. Now, other things. If the tines are crossed like this, obviously it's not going to work. There are ways to fix it. It takes a little bit of understanding what the nib is and how to press it and how to bend it back into place. But it might be better to just get a new nib because that can be quite frustrating. So that's how you should test your nibs when you're going to buy them. Now, I would normally walk into Cornelison's and I would stand at the nib counter and I would take a batch of nibs out and I would sort of press them and see which ones work. I say, oh, these ones don't work, send them back. And they would send them back to the manufacturer. The manufacturer would replace them. But if you're doing it online, it's a little bit more problematic. So just be conscious that you might not be the problem. You might be the problem, but quite a lot of the time, you are not the problem. The problem could be the nib got moved around during shipping, it got injured. I use injured because I consider nibs as people. It got injured in travel. The tines might have been a little bit bashed around. They might be a little bit bent. Can fix them, just be careful with them. But those are the two main things to look for. Now, I don't have that on the nib critique card because that's something that is prior to doing the testing. So let's get into the card and how to actually use it. So I'm not going to write my level. Right. So what I want you to do is the nib spread is very narrow, medium, wide, or very wide. So what you want to do is you want to press on your thumb, and I can feel the nib resisting. So that tells me that in order to get it to open wider, I have to press hard. That is a lot of pressure. I can really feel that both on my thumb and in the hand that's pressing. Now, that tells me that the nib spread is narrow. Not very narrow, because very narrow would be much stiffer than this. Now, so that's somewhere between a very narrow and a narrow. Now, I write quite lightly, so I would put that down as narrow. I would put that down as very narrow. Now, I'm using a pencil. I love these Pentel 0.3 pencils. I use them a lot, and they are the pencils that work best with the lining template because they can rule the cuts up quite nicely. Now, that's the very narrow. So, fineness of hairline. So this is where the writing starts. Now, I am using my own ink, which is the PAScribe Hamburg ink. This is the aged sepia ink, which is a sort of greeny, browny, yellowish ink. It's really an historical color that I saw in a manuscript, and we worked very hard to achieve this color. The reason why I'm using my ink is because I worked very hard with Hamburg to get this ink to do what I wanted to do. So I know the properties of this ink, and I know it will work for what I want, which is testing. If you're using another ink, you need to test the ink on its own, see what its properties are, see how it flows. Those are different things, which I'm not really going to cover in the video. The idea here is to choose an ink that you know, because you know it. Choose a paper that you know. I'm using the Canson marker pad. And from there, we're going to systematically work through the inks. So the only variables here are the nibs. So fineness of hairline. So let's go. I'm going to work at 2 millimeters. I'm actually going to work at 4 millimeters because I'm just testing the hairline. I'm going to write in a monoline. Now, I know this ink can write finer than that. So the fineness of the hairline, it's not a very fine hairline. It's, reasonably thick. So the fineness of hairline is, I would say, wide. So I'm just going to tick off, I'm going to put a little note there at wide. Now, from this, I can already immediately understand a number of things. So, fineness of letter. Immediately, this tells me that the letter is it's a medium letter. It's not a very fine letter, and it's not a very wide letter. Now I could press on it and really test it, but already I know this is telling me that it will not work big. Sorry, it will not work small. So there's a lot of information from just doing just some very, very simple tests. Pliability of nib, it's a very stiff nib. Control needed, very easy to work with. Hairline to shade, I would say, I would probably put it at a 2 because it's not really high. Spring versus snap. So spring versus snap, you really need to test it. Test this on a majuscule. So will it spring open? So if I press that, so that's 3, that's 6. So let's go to 12, 3, and 1, 3. Will it spring open? No. So it opens gradually. Does it snap shut? No, it doesn't. It closes gradually. That's really important to know. So spring versus snap, I would say, is about 2. If the spring and the snap are higher, I would go to 5. Right, and now this brings us to the other set of the other aspect, scale of letter. Xheight millimeters versus. So it can write at 2 millimeters, but it doesn't form the letters properly simply because the tip of the nib is too large. It works really well at 6 millimeters. Let's do some tests and see how it scales up. We know it doesn't work at 2. Can work at 4. I'm just going to do some unequal marks there. Let's go up to 6. We know it works at 6. That's great. Let's go up to 8. It's very good at 8. It does require a lot of pressure. And let's go up to 10. Okay. So it works really well at 6, 8, 6 and 8. Now, I'm going to put a cross through this, and I'm just going to do this. Because at 4, it's not too bad. It's great at 6, it's great at 8. At 10 and 12, something else happened. So the nib is resisting me. It's really fighting me. But it produces really sharp letters. Now, I can go back and make some notes in here. Control, very easy. Hairline to shade, 2, spring versus snap there. Writing type. So it's not that light. I would say it's a medium. Longevity of tip, I think it will last for a long time. So let's put 5. Coarse surface application would be 5 because it's actually, the coarse surface application might be 3 because if you have to press on it and the surface is coarse, it will rip the surface and it will cause some issues with lint. Now, notes. I can make some notes here. So what would I say? I would get the sheet out of the way. That's what I would do because the ink is still wet. Notes. Works well. Scale of Xheight, I would say 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Right. I've just sort of put some information in there. I would say best at 6 and 8. Rigid at 10 and 12. I might also just change this to my small caps writing. Rigid at 10 and 12. Nib resist at 10 and 12. But generates good line. You could write more there. So that's how I would use the nib critique sheet in conjunction with the nib critique card, in conjunction with the nib to Xheight, the nib to Xheight sheet. Sorry about that. You really need to spend some time with it. You might decide that, you know, if you're going to make 5, you know, your highest level, you know, sort of make a note about that, because if you're sharing this card, you really want people to be able to use the same information. It'd be great to see you guys using this with other nibs, as well as sharing this with your friends and sort of figuring out, what did you feel about this this particular nib? What were your thoughts on it, and how did you find it worked for you? So I'd love to hear your comments. And you can get this card and the sheet. They're very easy to download. I will leave a link in the description, and you can head over there and download them and have a crack at them. Thanks very much.